a Mark Brown Arthur chapter book. Arthur and the Perfect Brother, text by Stephen Krensky. Based on a teleplay by Joe Fallon. For Fred Rogers. Chapter 1. Arthur was painting a picture at the kitchen table when his sister D.W. sneaked up behind him. "I know you're there, D.W., he said. "I know I'm here, too," she answered. "Raining. Will you get the phone, D.W.?" asked Arthur. "I can't." D.W. was frowning. "I'm too busy trying to figure out what you're painting. Will you just answer the phone?" D.W. squinted at the paper. "Is that a horse or a pig?" "This isn't 20 questions, D.W. Go away." "You shouldn't talk to me like that," said D.W. "I'm your sister." "Don't remind me." Mrs. Reed entered from the living room. "Arthur, that was Alan's mother on the phone. She was just confirming his plans to stay with us this weekend." Arthur brightened. The brain was coming over because his parents were going on some kind of business trip. But Arthur didn't care about their trip. What he cared about was having a friend over for 2 whole days. "This is going to be great," said Arthur. "For once there'll be somebody who'll do all the things I like. It'll be like having a brother for the weekend." Arthur imagined all the fun stuff they could do. "Are you sure this will work?" asked Arthur, hammering the last nail into a wooden box with a glass bubble on top. The brain approached him wearing protective goggles and big rubber gloves. He was carrying a large glowing ball. "Just wait until I insert the nuclear core." "Will you open the door?" Arthur swung open a small door in the side of the box and the brain tossed the core inside it. Immediately the glass bubble began to glow. "Okay," said the brain, "we have ignition. Let's go." He and Arthur stepped inside. The brain pulled a lever and the box began to shake. Outside the bubble, houses and streets disappeared and the neighborhood became a forest. Arthur looked at his watch. Its hands were turning backward. "What time do you want to go home?" he asked. "Home?" said the brain. "That could be a problem. I don't know how to go forward in time. Just back." "You mean we're stuck here?" Outside, a crater closed up and a comet returned to space. A Tyrannosaurus appeared beside them and was opening its mouth to take a big bite. "Whoa," said Arthur, looking around the kitchen. Maybe it would be better to do something else, he thought. Inside his room, Arthur and the brain put on suction boots. Then they walked up the walls and onto the ceiling. D.W. entered the room. "Arthur?" Suddenly a hairy spider dropped down in front of her face. She screamed and ran out. Up on the ceiling, Arthur and the brain reeled in the spider, laughing hysterically. "Yes," said Arthur, smiling sweetly at his sister, "this will definitely be one weekend I'll never forget." Chapter 2. T-2 hours, 23 minutes and counting, Arthur said. He and D.W. were getting ready for lunch in the kitchen. At the stove, their father was seasoning his bubble trouble stew. He called it that in honor of the mess it always made on the stove. "I wasn't aware of any countdowns in progress," said Mr. Red. "What's the mission?" "It's the brain," said Arthur. "He'll be arriving for the weekend in 2 hours, 22 minutes. "I see. Do I still have time to change into my tuxedo? Will I be expected to make a speech?" No, said Arthur, "nothing like that." "Who can I have stay over for the weekend?" asked D.W. "It's not a competition, D.W., said her father. "Another time it will be your turn. But this weekend is Arthur's." Arthur nodded. "And I want it to go really well." So you all have to be especially nice to the brain. Make him feel at home. His father frowned. Arthur, isn't this the same brain we've known for years? The one who's been here hundreds of times before? Yes, but this is different, said Arthur. It will be more like he's part of the family. And we'll be hanging around together the whole time. Oh, brother, said D.W. In the den, Mrs. Red was lying on the floor playing with baby Kate. D.W. stomped in and plopped down in a chair. She did not look happy. Is something wrong, D.W.? Her mother asked. I'll say. It's hard enough dealing with Arthur. Once the brain is here, it'll be like having two Arthurs around. She shuddered at the thought. I'm sure you'll survive, said her mother, shaking a rattle at Kate. Maybe. D.W. huffed and puffed as she ran all around the living room. You'll never take me alive, she cried. There were two identical Arthurs, one on each end of the room. Each was holding strips of cloth bandages. Don't be silly, said Arthur number 1. We just want to play. You do like to play, don't you? Said Arthur number 2. Don't you want to play Egyptian princess? First, you're an Egyptian princess, said Arthur number 1, then you're a mummy. The two Arthurs started to walk toward D.W., their arms outstretched. No, cried D.W., go away. Mom. D.W. stood up and rushed out of the room. Maybe I should spend the weekend at Grandma Thora's, she muttered. I'm sure it would be much safer. Chapter 3. When the brain got out of his family's car, Arthur and his parents were waiting in the driveway. You're late, said Arthur. The brain looked at his watch. Only by 34 seconds. Oh, well, it seemed longer. Goodbye, Alan, said his mother. Be good. The brain nodded. Thanks again for having him, she said to Mrs. Red. Well, we're off to the ice creamers convention. We'll be back late tomorrow afternoon. She's nominated for Best New Flavor, said the brain's father. Cucumber Crunch. It sounds very healthy, said Mr. Red. As the brain's parents drove off, Arthur turned to him. Come on. Let's put your stuff in my room. The brain nodded. If you'll excuse us, he said to Arthur's parents. Yes, of course, said Mr. Red. Thank you, said the brain. He followed Arthur into the house. I've set up all my action figures, said Arthur as soon as they reached his room. Take your pick. In a minute, Arthur. The brain carefully unfolded his clothes from his bag. What are you doing? Just being careful. I don't want anything to get wrinkled. There. That's better. The brain picked up Rat Villain as Pal poked his head in the doorway. Look out, cried Rat Villain. Beware the giant mad dog. Pal barked. Then he jumped on them. Down, Pal, said Arthur. How's everything going? Said Mrs. Red. She looked into the room. We'll be eating in a few minutes. My, Alan, don't your clothes look neat? Arthur frowned, looking at his dirty laundry that was thrown here and there. He's just trying to make a good impression. The brain smiled. Mrs. Reed smiled back. It's working, she said. At dinner, Arthur couldn't eat fast enough. He shoved a forkful of food into his mouth with one hand and kept a grip on his glass with the other. The brain, however, cut everything up with his knife and chewed each bite carefully. Careful chewing leads to better digestion, he explained. I'm done! Arthur shouted. Let's go play. He pushed his chair back and jumped up. But the brain wasn't finished yet. Several minutes passed before he wiped his mouth with his napkin and turned to Arthur's father. "Dinner was delicious, Mr. Red. May I leave the table?" Mr. Red shared a glance with Mrs. Red. "Of course, Alan," he said. The brain rose slowly and pushed his chair back. Once he was out, though, he tucked the chair back in. Then he cleared his plate and loaded it in the dishwasher. "So what do you want to play now?" asked Arthur in the living room. "Actually," said the brain, "I was thinking we should do our homework first." "Why?" "This is still Saturday. It's not due till Monday." "But if we do it now," the brain went on, "we can read ahead to next week's lessons tomorrow." Arthur nearly fell over in shock. "Next week's lessons?" "That sounds very sensible, Alan," said Mrs. Red from the kitchen. "Oh, all right," said Arthur. Doing homework didn't sound like much fun, but Arthur wanted to be a good host. So he followed the brain upstairs in silence. Chapter 4. Arthur was lying on the floor of his room writing in his notebook. The brain was sitting at his desk nearby. "Is it time yet?" asked Arthur. The brain shook his head. "It's only 2 minutes later than the last time you asked, which was 3 minutes later than the time before that." Okay. I was just hoping for a break." Arthur looked down at his paper and then erased what he'd written. Why was it that something could make perfect sense in his head and then look so bad when it was put down on paper? Abruptly, the brain closed his book and put his papers away. "Are you giving up?" Arthur asked. No, said the brain. Done. Done? Arthur looked at his homework. How can you be done? He had only finished 2 out of the 10 questions. Can I look at your answers? Do you really want to do that? The brain asked. I mean, that won't help you learn how to do the problems yourself. All right, then. What if I just finish later? The brain shrugged. If you can live with the pressure of having unfinished homework hanging over your head, then it's okay with me. They went outside to play basketball in the driveway. Arthur took a shot, and it bounced off the rim. The brain got the rebound. He took a step out and then spun around for the fallaway jumper. Swish! The brain took the ball out. As Arthur lunged for him, he dribbled through Arthur's legs and went in for the easy layup. Swish! That was followed by 2 hook shots and a backward toss over his head. Swish! 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 My game, said the brain. Want to play again? Arthur was bent over, panting. You haven't missed yet. Maybe I'll go do my homework. Is it okay if I keep shooting? The brain asked. He sank a free throw. I like to shoot 100 free throws every day for practice. You mean you weren't just born this good? No, of course not, said the brain, sinking another shot. By the time the brain came back upstairs, Arthur had done 3 more math problems. He was sitting on the bed with Palestine. The brain started to get ready for bed. He changed into his pajamas and went into the bathroom to brush his teeth. You were gone a long time, Arthur said when he returned. Brushing and flossing can't be rushed, the brain explained. He lay down on the cot and pulled the blanket up to his chin. I guess not, Arthur admitted. Hey, while you were gone, I had an idea. After everyone else is asleep, do you want to sneak downstairs and watch Curse of the Puppet Sister on TV? The brain yawned. Wouldn't your parents get mad? Besides, it's important that we get our rest. It's while you sleep that you grow. Arthur flopped back down on his pillow. I'd rather be short and watch scary movies, he muttered. But the brain didn't hear him. He was already fast asleep. Chapter 5. When Arthur awoke the next morning, he rolled over onto his side. "Good morning, brain," he said. But the brain didn't answer. He was gone. Arthur quickly got dressed. It isn't like the brain